She was 7 years old, and she couldn't lift her arms above her shoulders. That was the thing that stopped Hank Mercer cold in the middle of the Prescott Hardware parking lot on a Tuesday morning in late October. Not the oversized sleeves, not the flinch when a car backfired 2 blocks over, not even the way she stood slightly behind the woman who was supposed to be her mother, making herself as small and invisible as a child could manage. It was the water bottle on the hood of a dusty pickup truck, and the way the little girl reached for it and stopped, her arms betraying her, her face going carefully, terrifyingly blank. The face of someone who had learned that wanting things out of reach was a mistake worth punishing. Hank had seen that face before. He'd seen it in the mirror 23 years ago, in a VA hospital in Tucson. He'd seen it on brothers who came back from places that don't appear on maps anymore. He'd seen it on his daughter the last time she looked at him before she stopped looking at all. He knew what that face cost a person to maintain. He picked up the water bottle. He set it on the tailgate where small hands could reach it. He walked away without a word, without looking back, because some things you do quietly or you don't do at all. But he didn't ride far, and he didn't stop watching. If this story already has your heart, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. We tell stories like this one because we believe the most powerful voices belong to the ones the world forgot to listen to. Drop a like and leave a comment with your city and country. Let us see how far this little girl's story has traveled. Now settle in. This one's going to take everything you've got. Part 1. The town of Prescott, Arizona had opinions about men like Hank Mercer, and it held them the way the desert holds heat, long after the sun went down, long after any reasonable person would have let it go. He'd lived here for 19 years. He knew every crack and every sidewalk on Gurley Street, knew which bartender at the Whiskey Row poured honest and which one had a thumb on the glass, knew the names of the sheriff's deputies and which ones crossed to the other side when they spotted his desert iron cut coming through the door. 19 years, and Prescott still looked at him the way it looked at a rattlesnake on a hiking trail. Not necessarily coming for you, but best to give it room. He didn't mind anymore. He'd made his peace with being a particular kind of man in a particular kind of world, and the peace wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. Hank was 47. He had gray threading through hair he kept too long and a beard that had given up any pretense of being groomed. His hands were the hands of a mechanic, scarred across the knuckles, permanently stained in the creases, capable of delicate work when they chose to be. There was a scar along his left jaw from a roadside outside Fallujah that he no longer thought about and never explained. His eyes were the color of old asphalt, and most people found them difficult to hold for long. He was not a man who sought attention. He was not a man who ran from it either. Desert Iron MC had 17 full members and a clubhouse on the east side of town that the city council had tried to zone out of existence twice and failed both times, not because the council was sympathetic to bikers, but because Hank's attorney was better than theirs and worked for flat rate. The club was not a criminal enterprise. It was not a social club either, not in the way people use that phrase. It was a collection of men who had each in different ways run out of places they fit and found, unexpectedly, that they fit with each other. Veterans, most of them. A couple of former firefighters. One man, Dex Torres, who had been a pediatric nurse before his back gave out, and he discovered that motorcycles were better therapy than anything a licensed professional had ever prescribed him. They were not gentlemen. Gentle wasn't the word. But they were careful. Careful with each other. Careful with the people who came into their orbit. Careful in the specific way that only people who have seen what carelessness costs tend to be. Hank had founded the club 14 years ago in the parking lot of a VFW hall with 4 men, 2 cases of beer, and a shared recognition that none of them were doing well on their own. He had not expected it to become what it became. He had not expected much of anything in those years. He had just been trying to stay on the road and keep moving, because moving was the only thing that reliably kept the past from catching up. He saw the little girl again 3 days after the hardware store. He was at May's Diner on Montezuma Street, sitting in the corner booth he always took because it faced the door and had a solid wall at his back. Old habits from overseas that his body maintained even when his mind wasn't paying attention. He was on his second cup of coffee and a newspaper he wasn't reading when the bell above the door announced her. She came in with the woman, the stepmother, though Hank didn't know that yet. He only knew her as the woman he'd seen in the parking lot. mid-30s, artificial blonde, wearing a tight expression and a phone she consulted more than she looked at the child. She took a booth near the window, dropped a menu in front of the girl without looking at her, and went back to her phone. The girl sat with her hands in her lap. She looked at the menu the way children look at menus when they've been taught not to expect what they want. She looked at the window. She looked at nothing in particular. Hank watched her over the rim of his coffee cup. She was small for 7, if he had to guess. And he'd guess around 7, though he wasn't certain, because she had the careful stillness of a child who had learned to be older than her age. Her hair was dark, cut plainly, falling just past her jaw. She wore long sleeves on a day that was pushing 70 degrees. When May's waitress came to take their order, the woman ordered for both of them without asking the girl what she wanted. The girl looked at the table. She didn't protest. She had learned, somehow, that protest cost more than it returned. Hank noticed that she never reached across the table, never extended her arms. When the waitress set her glass of water down slightly out of reach, the girl waited until the woman's attention was back on her phone and then leaned in carefully, rotating the glass to herself with minimal movement, her face tight with the effort of doing something that should have cost nothing. He paid his bill. He left. He sat on his bike in the parking lot for 11 minutes before he started the engine, and in those 11 minutes, he had a conversation with himself that he had learned to have slowly and honestly, because the fast version of that conversation always ended the same way, and the ending was rarely useful. What he felt was not sympathy. Sympathy was clean and simple, and what moved through him when he looked at that child was neither. It was recognition. It was the particular resonance of one damaged thing responding to another, not pity, not rescue instinct, but something older and more specific than either. The understanding of a man who knew what it looked like when a person had been systematically taught that their existence was a problem. He started the engine. He rode. He told himself he would let it go. He did not let it go. He talked to Ruth Pennington on a Thursday, though he didn't yet know her name, and finding her took 3 days of quiet work that he did not announce to anyone. He had noticed on 2 separate occasions a woman in her 70s watching from the front porch of a small house on Cortez Street as the woman he now knew as Diane Ashford loaded Lily into a car. Not the watching of a nosy neighbor. The watching of someone who had been doing it a long time and had stopped expecting it to change anything, but couldn't stop doing it anyway. He approached her on a morning when Diane's car was not in the driveway. He came on foot, not on the bike, because the bike announced itself, and this was not a situation for announcements. Ruth Pennington was 71 years old and had lived on Cortez Street for 34 years. She was the kind of woman who offered coffee before she asked your name, and when Hank accepted, she studied him across her kitchen table with eyes that had seen enough of the world to not be particularly impressed by leather jackets or jailbreak jawlines. "You've been watching her," he said. "Same as you," she said. That was the beginning. Ruth told him what she knew in the methodical, careful way of a person who understood that what she was saying could not be unsaid and had already decided that unsaying it was no longer an option. She had called Child Protective Services once, 14 months ago, after she heard sounds through the shared fence that left her sleepless for a week. A caseworker had come, had spoken with Glenn Ashford, the stepfather, a man Hank still hadn't seen but whose presence in the story arrived like weather, like the drop in pressure before a storm. The caseworker had filed a report marked inconclusive. The case had been closed. Lily had returned to that house, and Ruth had watched her return and had not stopped watching since. "The man," Ruth said, and then paused, setting her coffee cup down. "Glenn. He's smart about it. That's what makes it hard. He's smart about where, and he's smart about when, and he's smart about Lily." "About keeping her quiet," Hank said. Ruth looked at her hands. "About making her believe it's something she deserves." The silence that followed that sentence sat in Ruth's kitchen like a physical thing. Hank had spent a great deal of his adult life being a man who solved problems the fast way. The war had trained that into him, and the years after had not untrained it, and there were men still breathing in various cities across the Southwest who would testify, if pressed, that Hank Mercer's first instinct in a crisis was not conversation. His second instinct wasn't conversation either. He'd spent the better part of a decade working on the third instinct, the one that lived somewhere past the immediate math of violence and into the harder territory of consequence. He sat in Ruth Pennington's kitchen and did the math he didn't want to do. He did it honestly and slowly, the way he'd learned to. A man like Glenn, a situation like this, a child already failed once by the system. The fast solution would feel righteous for approximately 48 hours, and then Lily would be a child whose only advocate was in a jail cell. And the caseworker would close the file again, and Glenn would be careful for a month, and then stop being careful. And Ruth would keep watching from her porch until she couldn't anymore. The fast solution was not a solution. The fast solution was just Hank making himself feel better at Lily's expense. "I need everything you have," he told Ruth. "Dates, what you heard, what you saw, everything." Ruth nodded. She had been waiting, he understood, for someone to ask. He saw Lily for the third time on a Saturday morning at the Prescott Farmers Market on the Courthouse Plaza. She was with Glenn Ashford, and seeing Glenn for the first time was an experience that confirmed everything Hank's gut had already told him, while adding several things his gut hadn't known to anticipate. Glenn was not a large man. He was not physically imposing. He was perhaps 5'10", reasonably built, with a pleasant face and the easy, practiced sociability of someone who had long ago learned that charm was a tool and used it accordingly. He spoke to the market vendors with warmth. He smiled at passing acquaintances. He kept a hand on Lily's shoulder that looked, from a distance, like affection. Hank watched the hand. He watched the angle of Lily's body under it, the way she listed slightly away, the way she never quite relaxed into it. He watched her face when Glenn spoke to someone and stopped watching her. In those moments, for just a second, the careful blankness would slip and something raw and exhausted would surface before she put the mask back on. 7 years old, and she already had a mask. The thing that moved through Hank in that moment was not anger, though anger was present. Anger was always present. He had made his relationship with his anger into something more structured than most people managed. But it was still there. It was always there. The hot core of it that the desert heat and the engine noise and the open road could bank but never quite extinguish. What moved through him alongside the anger was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something that frightened him slightly because he had been certain, for several years, that it was dead. It felt like purpose. Not the purpose of a mission or a job or even a responsibility. The kind of purpose that arrives without negotiation and roots itself before you've had any say in the matter. He rode back to the clubhouse. He found Dex Torres in the garage working on a carburetor with the patient, unhurried attention he brought to mechanical problems and human ones in equal measure. "Need to talk," Hank said. Dex set down his tools. He wiped his hands. He looked at Hank's face with the specific attention of a man who had known him for 11 years. "Okay," he said. Hank told him about Lily. He told him about Ruth. He told him about the farmer's market and the hand on the shoulder and the mask. He told him about the 14 months ago and the caseworker and the closed file. He told all of it with the same slow, deliberate honesty with which he'd done the math in Ruth's kitchen. Because if he told it fast, he would tell it angry, and if he told it angry, he would talk himself into the fast solution. Dex listened without interrupting. This was one of Dex's qualities that Hank valued most. The man had learned, in years of pediatric nursing, that listening was not passive, that it cost something, that the person speaking deserved that cost. "What do you need?" Dex said when Hank had finished. "Documentation, dates. Someone who knows how CPS files cases and knows how to make a case that doesn't get closed as inconclusive." Hank's jaw was tight. "I need to do this right. I need it to stick." Dex was quiet for a moment. "You know someone's going to ask why this one." Hank had known that question was coming. He'd been thinking about the answer. "Because I was standing in the right parking lot," he said finally, "and because nobody else is." It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had a daughter named Casey who was 23 years old and lived in Flagstaff and hadn't answered one of his calls in 2 years, and that the last time he'd seen her, she had looked at him with Lily's same careful blankness, and he had understood, in a way he'd been avoiding for years, Exactly what he had cost her by being the kind of man who solved problems the fast way when she needed him to be the kind of man who stayed. He was not going to say that to Dex, not yet. But it was there. It was in the room with them, that truth. It had been in the room with him since the hardware store parking lot. "Okay," Dex said. He picked up his tools again, then set them back down. "Let's do it right." They spent the next week building the documentation. Dex called a contact he had from his nursing years, a woman who now worked as an advocate for a family services nonprofit in Flagstaff, who walked them through what a strong CPS report needed to contain and what typically led to cases being reopened with real weight behind them. Ruth Pennington wrote down everything she could remember, dates and times, and the specific language of what she had heard. And she did it with the steady composure of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity for a long time. Hank did not approach Lily. He understood, in the specific way of a man who had spent years thinking about what it meant to be safe, that nothing would undo his progress faster than frightening her. She had been given no reason to trust men like him. She had been given, from what he could piece together, very few reasons to trust anyone at all. So he kept his distance, and he kept watching, and he made himself useful in the background, where she could not see him and did not need to fear him. But on a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days after the hardware store, he was sitting on a bench outside the library on Goodwin Street when Lily Ashford walked past with Ruth. Ruth had apparently established a weekly arrangement that involved library visits and whatever amount of normalcy she could provide within the constraints of a situation she couldn't fully control. And Lily stopped. She looked at him. Not the flinching look she gave Glenn, not the careful nothing look she gave the world. She looked at him with the direct, slightly unnerving attention of a child who had learned to read adults the way some people read weather. Hank looked back. He didn't smile, because smiles from strangers were loaded things, and she would know that. He just looked back, steady, level, giving her nothing to interpret as threat. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. Ruth put a hand on Lily's shoulder, a different kind of hand, and even from here Hank could see that Lily knew the difference, and they moved on toward the library door. Hank sat on the bench for a long time after that. He watched the pigeons work the sidewalk. He drank the last of his gas station coffee, gone cold. He thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way a man does when something he thought he was managing turns out to be something that is managing him. The following Monday, Dex made the call to CPS with the full package of documentation. Ruth's account. Photographs of what could be photographed. A formal request for case reopening, properly worded by Dex's contact, that used the right language in the right order. They requested assignment to a specific investigator, Margaret Foster, whom Dex's contact knew by reputation as someone who took inconclusive cases personally. They also called Sheriff Tom Bradley's office. Not because Hank trusted law enforcement with the ease of a man who had never been profiled by it, but because he understood that Lily's protection required the system, not his fury at it. He was choosing the long road. He was choosing it deliberately, with full knowledge of what it cost and what it demanded, because the long road was the only one that ended somewhere Lily could actually live. He rode home in the dark, the Harley's engine a low thunder through Prescott's quiet streets, and somewhere on Gurley Street, beneath a neon bar sign that bled red into the October night, he thought about his daughter. He thought about the phone that didn't ring. He thought about the ways a man could be dangerous in the quiet rooms of a family without ever raising his voice or throwing a punch. The damage that came from absence, from choosing the fast solution, from being so consumed by his own war that he never noticed the casualties at home. He had not protected Casey the way she needed to be protected. He had not known, back then, what that kind of protection looked like, because no one had ever offered it to him either. He was learning, later than he should have, but he was learning. The night air smelled of pine and cold coming down from the mountains, and the neon blurred in his visor, and he told himself that he would sleep, and he knew he wouldn't. And somewhere across town in a house on Cortez Street, a 7-year-old girl was doing whatever she did in the dark to make it to morning, and she did not yet know that something was different, that something had changed, that there was a man on a Harley who had decided without fanfare or announcement to stand between her and the next thing that came for her. She didn't know it yet, but Ruth Pennington was keeping the light on, and Margaret Foster was picking up her files, and Hank Mercer was not riding away. And then, On a Thursday morning, 11 days after the CPS call, Dex's phone rang with a number neither of them recognized. Dex answered. He listened. His face did something Hank could not immediately read. Not alarm exactly, but a compression, a tightening of everything around his eyes. He hung up. He looked at Hank across the garage. Glenn Ashford filed a complaint, Dex said, against Ruth. Says she's been harassing the family, says she's unstable, says... He stopped. Hank. He's trying to have her removed as a witness before the case even opens. The engine in Hank's chest, the one that had been running quiet and controlled for 11 days, did something complicated. How fast can he do that? Hank said. Fast enough, Dex said. If nobody pushes back. Hank picked up his phone. He thought about who to call and in what order. He thought about Margaret Foster and Sheriff Bradley and Dex's contact in Flagstaff. He thought about the long road, the right road, the road that ended somewhere Lily could live. He started dialing, but before the first call connected, Ruth Pennington's name lit up his screen instead. And when he answered, her voice was not the steady, composed voice of a woman who had been waiting a long time. It was the voice of someone who had just been frightened, and Ruth Pennington was not a woman who frightened easily. He knows, she said. Hank, he knows someone filed on him, and he took Lily out of school an hour ago, and I don't know where they went. Hank was already moving before Ruth finished the sentence. He didn't run. Men like him didn't run, not because of pride, but because running made noise and noise made mistakes. But he crossed the garage in 8 steps that covered ground like 12, and he was on the Harley with the engine alive before Dex had fully processed what he'd heard through the thin wall between their voices. Where was she last? Hank said into the phone, his voice flat and controlled the way voices go when the body has dumped everything unnecessary and kept only function. School let out at noon today. Early release. I forgot about it, Hank. I forgot. Ruth's breath was wrong, choppy and too high in her chest, and he needed her lower. Ruth. He said her name like a hand on her shoulder. Stop. Where was she last? A pause. The sound of Ruth pulling herself back from the edge of something. Prescott Gateway Elementary, on Rosser Street. Glenn signed her out at 11:48. The office said he seemed fine. Normal. That's what they said. Normal. Normal. The word landed in Hank's chest like something cold. Where does Glenn go? He said. When things go wrong. Where does he take her? I don't know. There's a storage unit. He has a storage unit somewhere out on Highway 89. Diane mentioned it once. I don't know the number. Okay, Hank said. I'm moving. Keep your door locked and your phone on. He ended the call. Dex was beside him now, jacket on, keys in his hand, reading Hank's face with 11 years of practice. Glenn took the girl, Hank said. He knows the case is reopened. Dex said one word, quiet and without inflection. Where? Don't know yet. Hank pulled out his phone again, scrolling to Margaret Foster's number. Call Boone and Reyes. Tell them to sit on Cortez Street. Don't engage, just watch the house in case he brings her back. He paused. Tell them quiet, no vests. Dex was already dialing as Hank pressed call on Foster's line. It rang 4 times. 5. He was composing what he'd say to voicemail when she picked up, her voice carrying the particular compression of someone who had been in the middle of something and chose to answer anyway. Foster. It's Mercer. Glenn Ashford pulled Lily from school an hour ago. He knows about the case. A beat of silence that told him she was absorbing and not reacting, which was a good sign about the kind of investigator she was. How do you know he knows? He filed a harassment complaint against our primary witness this morning. Moved to discredit her before you could talk to her. Then pulled the kid. Another beat. He could hear papers moving. Okay, I'm calling this in. Don't... She paused, and he understood she was making a calculation about what to say to a man like him in a situation like this. Mr. Mercer, don't do anything that makes my job harder. Wasn't planning to, he said, and ended the call. That was not entirely true, but it was true enough for the next 20 minutes. He found Highway 89 in 4 minutes on the Harley, the October air hitting him like cold glass, and he ran the storage facilities from memory. There were 2 on this stretch, a U-Store-It and a bigger operation called Desert Safe that had 3 rows of roll-up doors and a gate code that changed monthly. He tried U-Store at first because it was smaller and closer, and Glenn struck him as a man who chose convenience when he could. Glenn's truck was not there. He rode another quarter-mile. Desert Safe's gate was closed but not locked. The padlock was missing, which meant someone had either broken it or had a key and removed it to make the gate look secured without actually securing it. Hank pushed it open with one hand and rode through slowly, the Harley dropping to idle, his eyes moving across the rows. 3rd row. A truck he didn't recognize until he was close enough to see the partial plate he'd memorized from the farmer's market. He stopped the bike 40 feet back. He killed the engine. He sat in the silence of the storage facility and thought about Margaret Foster's voice saying, "Don't do anything that makes my job harder." And he thought about Ruth on the phone, her breath all wrong. And he thought about Lily in that library doorway saying hi with the directness of a child who had decided against all available evidence that this particular stranger might be safe. He did not go to the unit. He did not move at all. He took out his phone and called Margaret Foster back and said, "Desert Safe Storage, Highway 89, 3rd row." Then he parked the Harley 2 rows over behind a row of units that blocked the sightline to Glenn's truck, and he waited. Waiting was the hardest thing he had ever learned to do. He was still waiting 11 minutes later when Dex called. "Boone's on Cortez," Dex said. "Reyes is running secondary on 89 South in case they move. What do you need from me?" "Come to Desert Safe, slowly. Don't park close." Hank paused. "And Dex, I need you to talk to me." A beat. "About what?" "Anything. Just—" He stopped, swallowed something he didn't name. "Just keep me on the phone." There was a pause in which Dex did not ask why, because Dex understood without asking what it meant when a man who had trained himself into patience asked someone to keep him company while he practiced it. "Okay," Dex said. "I'll talk. You listen." Dex talked about nothing. He talked about a carburetor and a fight he'd had with his landlord about a dripping faucet and a documentary he'd watched the night before about migratory birds that took routes nobody could fully explain. He talked in the low, unhurried way of a man filling space with something warm and human, and Hank listened and watched the 3rd row and kept his hands loose and his breathing even. And 14 minutes later, 2 sheriff's vehicles turned into the Desert Safe lot without sirens, which was the right call. And Margaret Foster was out of a gray sedan behind them before either deputy had fully opened their doors. She walked to the 3rd unit without looking at Hank, which told him she'd clocked where he was and chosen not to acknowledge it, which was also the right call. He watched her knock. He watched the door open after a pause that was too long to be innocent. He watched Glenn Ashford's pleasant face arrange itself into something that looked like confusion. He watched Lily step out from behind Glenn's leg and stand in the pale October light, and she was unhurt, which was the only thing that mattered in that moment, the only data point that kept his hands where they were. She was unhurt, but she was frightened, and the distinction between those 2 things would keep Hank awake for a long time. He rode back to the clubhouse without stopping. He went directly to the back room they used for church, their word for the closed-door meetings where Desert Iron made its decisions. And he sat at the table and stared at the wall until Dex came in 20 minutes later and sat across from him. "She's okay," Dex said. "I know." Foster took her statement. "Glenn's being questioned. They're not booking him tonight, Hank. The threshold for—" "I know," Hank said again. Dex was quiet. The refrigerator in the corner hummed. Outside, through the cinder block walls, the faint sound of the interstate. A sound Hank had fallen asleep to for 19 years without noticing it until right now. "You went out there alone," Dex said. Not an accusation, an observation that contained one. "I found her faster alone." "You found her location. That's different from going in." "I didn't go in." "This time?" Dex set his keys on the table, looked at them. "Hank, the guys are asking questions." Hank looked up. "What kind of questions?" "The kind men ask when their president is involved in something personal and they don't have the full picture." Dex met his eyes steadily. "Boone thinks it's a debt. Somebody Glenn owes somebody. Reyes thinks—" He stopped. "What does Reyes think?" Dex breathed out slowly. Reyes thinks it's about Casey. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples of it went all the way to the walls. Hank did not respond immediately. He did what he did when the thing coming at him was too true to deflect. He let it arrive, and he sat with it, and he waited until he could hold it without dropping it. Reyes isn't wrong, he said finally. Dex nodded once, slowly. But that's not all it is, Hank said. I need you to know that. It's not a guilt project. She's not a stand-in. He pressed his palms flat on the table. She's a kid who's being hurt. That's the whole reason. I know, Dex said, but I need the guys to know. Then you need to tell them yourself. Church was called for 8 o'clock. All 17 members. The room smelled of engine grease and old coffee, and the particular kind of cigarette smoke that accumulates in spaces where men come to be honest. Hank sat at the head of the table and told them everything, the same way he'd told Dex in the garage, with the same slow deliberateness. He told them about Lily and about Ruth and about the closed case from 14 months ago. He told them about Glenn's harassment complaint and the storage facility and Foster's investigation. He told them why he hadn't brought it to church before now. He told them about Casey. Not all of it. Enough. The specific enough that a room of men who each had their own version of the same failure could receive it without it becoming something else. Not confession, not plea. Just the relevant fact that made his particular investment in this case something other than a professional president's cool calculation. When he finished, the room was quiet. Boone spoke first. He was the oldest member, 53, and had served 2 tours in a different war from Hank's, and come back with a stutter that disappeared when he was absolutely certain of what he was saying. So we're doing this right, he said. Not a question. We're doing it right, Hank said. No side trips to Glenn's address at 2 in the morning. Boone looked around the table. No creative problem solving. No, Hank said. That's not what Lily needs. Another silence. Then Reyes said from the far end of the table, What does she need? And that was the question Hank had been asking himself for 2 weeks, and the answer was still arriving in pieces, still assembling itself from evidence and instinct and a knowledge of damage that only a particular kind of life could build. She needs to see the system do what it's supposed to do, Hank said. She needs to see it work. Because if it doesn't work, she won't believe it ever can, and that's a thing she'll carry for the rest of her life. He stopped. We back the system up. We fill in the gaps the system leaves. That's it. The vote to formally commit Desert Iron's support to Lily's case was 14-0, with 3 members not present. It was the fastest unanimous vote the club had ever taken on anything that wasn't an immediate physical threat. Hank didn't feel triumphant about that. He felt the weight of it, which was the appropriate feeling. The next 72 hours moved in the specific unreality of a situation where you are doing everything correctly and the outcome is still not in your control. Margaret Foster ran her investigation with the thoroughness her reputation had promised. She interviewed Ruth, she documented what could be documented, she requisitioned Lily's medical records, and what she found in those records was enough that she did not share the details with Hank, but her face when she called him told him everything he needed to know. Lily was placed in emergency protective custody on a Friday afternoon. The house on Cortez Street was quiet when it happened, no drama, just a car and a caseworker and a small bag that Ruth had helped pack the night before, because someone had told Ruth it was coming. Hank found out when Dex called him at 4:17 in the afternoon while he was in the middle of rotating tires on a member's truck. He put down the wrench. He sat on the garage floor with his back against the truck's front bumper, and he did something he hadn't done in longer than he could accurately remember. He breathed. Just that. In and out, until his hands stopped wanting to be fists. She was out. She was safe. The system had done the thing it was supposed to do this time, and the thing it had failed to do 14 months ago was now in the process of being corrected, and that was not the end, but it was something solid to stand on. He was still sitting on the floor when his personal phone rang. Unknown number with an Arizona area code he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered instead because he had been answering unknown numbers all week, and most of them had mattered. The voice on the other end was young, female. careful in the way Ruth had taught him to recognize as someone choosing words around a large and painful thing. "Is this Hank Mercer?" she said. "Yeah," he said. A pause. "I'm Lily's school counselor, Andrea Voss. Another pause. "She asked for you." Hank was very still. "She asked for you by name. She said the man outside the library. She said she thinks you're safe, so." A third pause. "I can't give you access to her right now. That's not how it works. But I needed to tell you because she—" Voss's voice did something compressed. "She asked 3 times. She said she was worried you wouldn't know she was okay." Hank pressed his free hand against the concrete floor of the garage. He pressed it flat and felt the cold and the grease-stained texture of it. "Tell her I know," he said. His voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Tell her the library man says she did the bravest thing he's ever seen." The call ended. He sat on the floor another minute. Then he got up, picked up the wrench, and went back to the tires, because a man has to put his hands on something or the feeling becomes too large for the body to hold. The problem arrived 3 days later, and it arrived, as problems usually do, from a direction he hadn't been watching. Glenn Ashford had a brother. His name was Dale, and Dale was not the careful, charming, socially intelligent version of the Ashford damage. Dale was the unprocessed version, the one that hadn't learned to put a face on it. Dale drove a lifted Ram and had a record for assault that had never quite accumulated enough to stick. And he had been, Hank learned from Sheriff Bradley, in a phone call that did not improve his afternoon, making inquiries about Ruth Pennington's address that were not the kind of inquiries you made when you wished someone well. "How solid are those inquiries?" Hank said. "Solid enough that I've got a deputy doing drive-bys on her street," Bradley said. "But I can't park someone there permanently. Resources." "What can you do?" A pause that meant Bradley was going to tell him something he didn't fully want to say. "I can tell you that Dale Ashford left the Prescott city limits yesterday heading north. And I can tell you that one of my deputies spotted a truck matching Dale's description parked 2 blocks from Ruth's house this morning before it moved on." "Which means he came back," Hank said. "Which means he's scouting," Bradley said. "I don't know what for. I'm telling you because you're already in this and because I'd rather you know and respond correctly than not know, and—" He stopped. "Respond incorrectly," Hank said. "That's not the phrase I'd use, but yes. He called Dex. He called Boone. He did not call the full club because the full club showing up at Ruth's house would be visible, and visible was pressure, and pressure might accelerate whatever Dale was calculating. He sent 2 members in a plain truck, not the bikes, not the cuts, to Cortez Street with instructions to park down the block and watch. And he drove himself in the shop's work van because the Harley on this street, in this situation, was a signature he couldn't afford. Ruth opened her door before he knocked. She had been watching from the window. "Come in," she said. Her kitchen looked different at night, smaller. The coffee she put in front of him was too strong, the way coffee gets when it's been on the burner since anxiety started, which in this house was probably early morning. "You knew about Dale," he said. Ruth sat down across from him. She wrapped both hands around her own mug. "I've seen him twice. Once last week, once this morning." "You didn't call me." "I didn't want to be the reason something happened." She met his eyes. "I know what kind of man you are, Hank. I know what kind of men your club is. I didn't want my fear to be the thing that—" "Ruth." His voice came out harder than he meant it to. He pulled it back. "Keeping information from me doesn't protect anyone. It just means I'm working blind." She looked at her coffee. "I know that now." The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was the silence of 2 people recalibrating their trust, finding where it held and where it needed reinforcement. Hank had a lot of experience with that kind of silence. He didn't rush it. "I'm putting people on your street," he said. "Quiet. You won't see them much, but they're there. You need something. You call me first, not last." He paused. "And you need to tell me anything else you haven't told me. Anything. Small things. Things you think don't matter." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she said, "Glenn called me." Hank set down his coffee. "Yesterday," she said, "in the afternoon. He was—" He wasn't angry. That was what frightened me. He was calm. He said, she stopped, arranged her breath. He said that the people trying to help Lily didn't understand what they were getting into. He said families have a way of protecting themselves that the courts don't always see. And then he said, another stop. Her hands tightened around the mug. He said he hoped I'd been keeping up with my health. The temperature in Ruth Pennington's kitchen dropped several degrees, and none of it was the weather. Hank looked at the woman across from him, 71 years old, alone in her house, doing the right thing at a cost she hadn't fully budgeted for when she started. And he felt the anger move through him the way it always moved, the clean, hot line of it, and he let it move and he did not follow it. You should have called me the second you hung up, he said. I know, she said. Quiet. I was ashamed that he scared me. Being scared of that man is not something to be ashamed of. He held her gaze until she held his back. You understand me. She nodded once. He drove back to the clubhouse at 11:30 and found Dex and Boone in the main room and two other members, Cisco and Wheeler, sitting at the bar with the particular posture of men who had been waiting to hear something they weren't going to like. Hank told them about the call to Ruth. He told them about Dale's scouting. He told them what Bradley had said about resources and drive-bys and the gap between what the sheriff's office could do and what the situation required. When he finished, Boone said, he's building a case to discredit her. Or worse, Wheeler said. Or worse, Boone agreed. He looked at Hank. This changed. Yeah, Hank said. It changed the night he called a 71-year-old woman and suggested her health was a variable, Boone said. His voice was completely flat, which in Boone's case meant the stutter had gone quiet, which meant he was certain of every word. What are we doing? Hank looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the wall. He had spent 2 weeks building the slow, careful architecture of doing this right, the long road, the road that ended somewhere Lily could live. And he felt the architecture under pressure now, not breaking, but flexing, the way structures do when the load they were built for arrives. We stay on the right side of this, Hank said. That doesn't change, but we expand the perimeter. He looked around the table. Ruth doesn't spend a night alone until the hearing. 2 people on Cortez at all times. I'm calling Bradley in the morning and I'm telling him about the phone call. That's documented harassment. That's something he can act on. He paused. And I want someone finding out where Dale Ashford is sleeping right now. Finding out, not visiting, Dex said. Finding out, Hank confirmed. That's all. They dispersed after midnight. Hank stayed at the table alone. He was tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep, the deep cellular tiredness of sustained effort against a problem that kept moving. He thought about Lily in emergency custody somewhere in Prescott, in a room she didn't know, with people who were doing their best, which was not the same thing as the best. He thought about what Andrea Voss had said. She asked for you by name. She was worried you wouldn't know she was okay. A 7-year-old in the middle of her own crisis, spending mental energy worrying about whether he knew she was safe. He put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a while, in the empty church room, the refrigerator humming, the interstate a whisper through the walls. His personal phone buzzed on the table. He looked at the screen. A text from a Flagstaff number. Not in his contacts. 3 words. I heard, call me. He stared at it. His thumb hovered over the screen. The number wasn't familiar, but the area code was Flagstaff, and there was exactly one person in Flagstaff who had any reason to have heard anything about any of this, because the only person who had any connection to him in that city was... The phone buzzed again. Same number. Dad, it's Casey. Hank set the phone on the table. He looked at it. He looked at the wall. He looked at the door of the church room, the dark hallway beyond it, the small, ordinary world of the clubhouse at midnight. Then he picked up the phone and called his daughter for the first time in 2 years. And on the second ring she answered, and the first sound she made wasn't a word. It was something smaller and more honest than a word. And Hank Mercer, who had not cried since a hospital in Tucson in 2003, felt the pressure behind his eyes that a man carries for years, telling himself it has nowhere to go until something small and specific proves him wrong. Casey, he said. Yeah, she said. Her voice was careful, loaded. 23 years of a complicated history arranged itself in the space between that one word and whatever was going to come next. "How did you hear?" he said. "Ruth Pennington found my number," she said. "She said you might need to hear from me. She said you were—" A pause. "She said you were finally doing it right." And before he could find the words to answer that, before he could navigate the landmine field of everything between himself and this voice on the phone, another call hit his screen. Boone, whose calls never came at midnight unless the situation had moved. He looked at his daughter's name on one screen and Boone's on the other. "Casey," he said, "don't hang up. I need 1 minute." He switched lines. "Boone." "Wheeler found Dale's truck," Boone said, and his voice was the completely flat, stutter-free voice of absolute certainty. "It's parked outside Desert Safe Storage on Highway 89. The cold moved through Hank's chest from sternum to spine. "He's not there for his stuff," Boone said. "Wheeler checked the unit registry. Dale Ashford doesn't have a unit there." Glenn had pulled Lily to that storage facility. Glenn had known someone was watching. And now Dale was parked outside it in the middle of the night. And the only thing Dale knew about that location was whatever Glenn had told him, and whatever Glenn had told him, he'd sent his brother there at midnight for a reason that was not good. "Don't move on him," Hank said. "Call Bradley. Now. Tell him we have eyes on Dale Ashford at Desert Safe Storage, and we need a deputy there in 10 minutes. "Already dialing," Boone said. Hank switched back to Casey. Her voice came back immediately, as if she'd been holding her breath. "What's happening?" she said. "Something I have to deal with right now," he said. "Casey, I need you to stay on this call. Can you do that? Just stay on." A pause, then, "Yeah," she said. "I'm here." He was already moving toward the door, keys in his hand, and his daughter's voice in his ear was the most complicated sound he'd heard in years. And outside, the Harley was waiting, and somewhere on Highway 89, Dale Ashford was parked outside a storage facility at midnight for a reason that was moving toward an edge Hank couldn't see yet. And what he found when he got there would decide whether the long, careful road he'd been building for 2 weeks could hold the weight of everything that was now, all at once, coming due. He made it to Highway 89 in 6 minutes. Casey's voice stayed in his ear the whole way. Not talking, just breathing, the specific quality of someone sitting with a phone pressed to their face in the dark of an unfamiliar hour, present in the way that costs something. He didn't ask her to speak. He didn't speak himself. The Harley's engine filled everything that didn't need filling and left the rest for the sound of his daughter existing on the other end of the line, which was more than he'd had 2 hours ago and more than he'd expected to have tonight. Wheeler's truck was parked 100 yards short of the Desert Safe entrance, lights off, engine cold. Hank pulled in beside it and killed the Harley. Casey's breathing continued in his ear, patient and complicated. "I have to go," he said. A pause. "Okay." "Don't disappear," he said. Another pause. Longer, loaded with 2 years of silence and whatever it had cost her to break it. And then, "I'll be here." He pocketed the phone. Wheeler materialized from the dark beside the truck, a big man in a plain jacket, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years in situations that rewarded stillness. "Dale's still there," Wheeler said, his voice just above breath. "Hasn't moved. Truck's parked at the far end of the 3rd row." He paused. "Someone's in there with him." Hank looked at him. "Glenn." "Can't confirm, but there's a second vehicle. Older Civic, no plates I can read from here." Wheeler's jaw tightened slightly. "And there's light coming from under one of the units." Units at midnight with no plates and light bleeding under the door. Hank ran the math. Glenn had pulled Lily to this facility 2 weeks ago when he panicked. Glenn was a man who planned, who calculated, who kept a face on things. And men like that kept things, documents, insurance, leverage. He thought about the harassment complaint filed the same morning as the CPS call, the speed of it, the specificity of naming Ruth as unstable. That wasn't a man reacting. That was a man who had a response already prepared, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of threat and had assembled his countermove in advance. Which meant Glenn Ashford had been expecting someone to come for him long before Hank arrived in the picture. Bradley's deputy rolled in 90 seconds later. Single car, which was what Bradley had managed at midnight. A deputy named Ferris, who was young enough that Hank could see the effort it cost him to walk toward the situation instead of away from it. Good instinct, doing it anyway. Hank respected that. You've got 2 males, 1 confirmed vehicle, 1 unconfirmed, 3rd row, active light source in one of the units, Hank said, keeping it factual and quick because Ferris didn't need analysis. He needed logistics. I'll hold the entrance. You don't go in without backup. Ferris looked at him. Sir, you are not... I'm not going in, Hank said. I'm holding the entrance so they don't go out. Call your backup. I'll be a traffic cone. Ferris made the call. Hank moved the Harley to block the gate opening, which was a thing a traffic cone could legitimately do, and he stood beside it with his hands visible and his body language communicating exactly what he needed it to communicate. Immovable, not hostile, a wall and not a weapon. The second deputy arrived in 4 minutes. They went in together, which was right. Hank heard voices from the 3rd row. 1 sharp command, 1 response that carried the specific register of a man deciding how to play a situation. And then it went quiet, the way situations go quiet when the people in them understand what their options are. Glenn and Dale Ashford were placed in the backs of separate vehicles 17 minutes after Hank arrived at the gate. Glenn passed within 15 feet of him on the way to the car. He looked at Hank with that pleasant face arranged into something that was trying to be neutral and achieving something closer to a calculation. Reading him, measuring him, filing him under a category Hank didn't want to speculate about at this hour. Hank looked back. He said nothing. He let Glenn read whatever he found. The unit they'd been in was left open. Ferris's partner photographed it while waiting for Sheriff Bradley to arrive. Hank didn't go in. He stood at the gate and looked at the stars over the desert and breathed the cold air that smelled of highway dust and the far-off suggestion of winter coming down from the mountains, and he told himself that this was progress. This was the long road delivering, the system doing what it was supposed to do. He told himself that until Bradley arrived and walked directly to him with a face that said the system had found something none of them had budgeted for. "Come look at this," Bradley said. Not a question. The unit was 12 by 20. It had a folding table, a plastic storage bin, a sleeping bag rolled in the corner that nobody had slept in recently, and 2 things that reorganized everything Hank thought he knew about this situation. The first was a manila envelope containing a document that Ferris's partner was already photographing, a quitclaim deed on a property in Chino Valley, notarized 18 months ago, transferring ownership to a name Hank didn't recognize. The second was a cardboard box, open, containing 11 additional envelopes, each one labeled in Glenn's careful handwriting with dates and names. Hank read the visible names from where he stood, without touching anything. He read them twice. He felt the specific physical sensation of the ground shifting under a structure you thought was solid. 3 of the names on those envelopes were members of the Yavapai County Department of Child Protective Services. The name on the 4th envelope was Margaret Foster. Bradley was watching him. "You recognize those names?" "One of them," Hank said. His voice came out even, which was a technical achievement. "Foster's my CPS contact. She reopened Lily's case." Bradley nodded slowly. He had the expression of a man who has found a thing he did not want to find and is now responsible for it. "We don't know what's in the envelopes yet. Could be nothing." "With a quitclaim deed and a storage unit he drove to at midnight," Hank said. "It's not nothing." Bradley didn't argue with that. Hank rode back to the clubhouse and woke Dex, and he told him what he'd seen, not all of it, just the architecture of it, the bones, because until he knew what was in those envelopes, the details were speculation, and speculation was dangerous. "He was building leverage," Dex said. He was sitting on the edge of the workbench in the garage, still in the clothes he'd been wearing when Hank called him at midnight, his face carrying the exhausted focus of a man running on coffee and necessity. Against the caseworkers, against Foster. "Looks like," Hank said. "Which means he's done this before." Dex looked at the floor. "Not just with Lily. This is a system. You build that kind of... You don't build that in one case. That's years." Hank had been thinking the same thing since the highway, and he had been thinking it with a specific cold clarity that he found more frightening than anger. Because if Glenn Ashford had been running this kind of operation, documenting, collecting, building leverage against the people positioned to stop him. And if he had been doing it long enough to have 11 envelopes with multiple CPS names on them, then the question was not only what he had done to Lily. The question was who else had he done it to? And how long had they been silent because he had made silence the cheaper option? The question was also, and this was the one that lived at the bottom of everything, cold and specific, whether Margaret Foster's name was on that envelope because she was someone Glenn was building leverage against, or because she was someone who had already made an arrangement. Hank did not say that out loud. Not yet. He needed more before he could carry that thought anywhere useful. He called Foster's number at 7:15 in the morning. She answered on the third ring, and her voice carried nothing unusual. Not the compression of a woman who knew what had been found, not the particular smoothness of someone who had spent the night composing a face for this call. Just tiredness. The honest tiredness of someone who'd been working a hard case. "I need to see you," he said. "Today." Not a phone call. A pause. "Has something happened with Lily?" "Not with Lily." He kept his voice neutral. "Something else. I need you to see something with me." Another pause, longer this time. He listened to it the way you listen to silence in a room for what it contains. "Okay," she said. 2:00. I'll come to your address." "No," he said. "Sheriff Bradley's office. I want it on record." The pause that followed this was different from the others. Shorter, sharper. And then, "All right." He spent the morning with Dex and Boone going through everything they had documented. Every date, every call, every interaction with CPS since the case was filed. He was looking for gaps. Moments where information had moved when it shouldn't have, or failed to move when it should. He found two, both small, both explainable by normal institutional slowness, but together, in the same week, pointing the same direction. At 1:40, he drove to Bradley's office. He arrived early on purpose and sat in Bradley's actual office, not the lobby, because Bradley had offered it and because Hank needed the specific psychological architecture of sitting where the authority was when Foster arrived. She came in at 2:00 exactly. She was a woman in her mid-40s with the kind of composed face that came from years in rooms where composure was professional armor, and she sat across from Bradley's desk with the particular economy of someone who was calibrating constantly. She looked at Hank. She looked at Bradley. She read the room. "Tell me what's happening," she said. Bradley laid out what had been found at Desert Safe in the flat language of official documentation. He said Glenn and Dale Ashford had been detained. He said the unit had been documented. He said there was an envelope with her name on it. Foster's face did not change. That was the thing Hank watched. The specific quality of her face not changing, which could mean composure, which could mean practice. "I'd like to know what's in it," she said. "So would we," Bradley said. "We're getting a warrant for the contents. That takes time." He looked at her steadily. "What I need from you right now is to understand how Glenn Ashford knew, within hours of our call to your department, that a case had been filed against him." The room was quiet. Outside, a phone rang somewhere down the hall and was answered, and the voice went muffled through walls. Foster breathed in. She breathed out. She set her hands flat on her knees, and Hank watched her hands, because hands were honest when faces weren't. "He has a contact inside the department," she said. Bradley said, "Who?" "I don't know." She looked at Bradley directly. "I've suspected for 8 months. I have no proof. What I have is 2 cases in the last year where families with resources received what appeared to be advance notice that a filing was coming." She paused. "I didn't report my suspicion because I had nothing solid, and I was afraid of what would happen to the cases if I raised it." Hank looked at his hands on his knees. He thought about the careful architecture of doing things right, and he thought about what it looked like when a corrupt element was operating inside that architecture without anyone being able to name it. "The envelope," he said. Foster looked at him. "Your name on that envelope," he said. Glenn was building leverage. The other names on the envelopes, do you know them? She was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. 2 of them, she said, from previous cases. Were they compromised? Her jaw tightened. It was the first fracture in the composed face. One of them took early retirement 14 months ago. immediately after Lily's first case was closed inconclusive. The room reconfigured itself. Hank felt it happen. The specific sensation of a picture you thought you understood, revealing an additional dimension. 14 months ago. The first case. The caseworker who had come, filed an inconclusive report, closed the file. Not because there was nothing to find, because someone had told Glenn it was coming. He had 14 months to build a file on whoever closed his case, Hank said. Not as evidence against them, as insurance, in case they ever changed their mind. He looked at Foster. And he put your name in the same box because you reopened it. Foster was very still. He was going to use whatever's in that envelope to shut you down, Hank said. Or to make shutting you down look like your own professional misconduct. He paused. What's in it, Foster? The question landed in the room like a stone. She looked at Bradley. She looked at Hank. She breathed through something that moved across her face for less than a second before she controlled it. 3 years ago, she said, I had a case. A family in Chino Valley. I documented abuse. I filed. The father's attorney produced evidence that I had failed to follow proper procedure on a home visit. I'd conducted it without the required supervisor co-signature because my supervisor was unreachable and the situation was immediate. She held Hank's gaze. It was a procedural violation. The family's attorney used it to get the case dismissed. The children went back. She stopped. I don't know how Glenn Ashford knows about that case. It should be sealed. Hank said nothing for a moment. He was doing math he didn't want to do. How did that family's attorney know about the procedural violation in the first place? He said. Foster closed her eyes. A brief closure. When she opened them, what was in them was not guilt. It was the specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a question they couldn't answer for 3 years and had just watched someone else ask it. I never knew, she said. I could never figure out who told them. Same contact, Bradley said. Quiet. Statement, not question. Same contact, Foster agreed. They sat with that for a moment. The scope of it. One person inside the department feeding information to Glenn Ashford, or to someone connected to Glenn, for years, protecting him. And Glenn building his parallel archive of leverage against everyone who got close enough to threaten him, as backup, as the failsafe in case the inside contact wasn't enough. Hank stood up. He moved to the window. He looked at the Prescott Street below. The ordinary midday motion of it, cars and pedestrians and a dog pulling a leash, with the specific, cheerful indifference of dogs to the gravity of situations happening above their heads. Lily's hearing, he said. When is it? 9 days, Foster said. Can you guarantee that whoever the contact is can't interfere with the hearing? Foster was quiet. Foster? No, she said. I can't guarantee that. Not until we know who it is. Hank turned from the window. Then we need to know who it is in 9 days. Bradley said, That's a department investigation. That takes... I know what it takes, Hank said. I'm telling you what the deadline is. He left Bradley's office at 3:15. He drove back toward the clubhouse in the kind of focused silence that came after a situation had reorganized itself beyond the parameters you'd been working in, when the problem you thought you were solving turned out to be a surface, and underneath it was a different and larger problem that had been running while you addressed the one you could see. He called Dex from the parking lot. Pull church for 6 o'clock, he said. All members. I need everyone there. What happened? Dex said. Glenn Ashford isn't the problem, Hank said. Glenn Ashford is the symptom. The problem is someone inside CPS who's been protecting him for years and is still active. He paused. And Lily's hearing is in 9 days. Dex was quiet for 2 seconds. You think they'll try to tank the hearing? I think a man who built a leverage archive against his caseworkers and knew the filing was coming within hours does not leave his hearing outcomes to chance, Hank said. I think he has something planned, and I don't know what it is, and I have 9 days to find out. Church at 6 o'clock was the quietest the room had ever been. Hank told them everything. The storage unit, the envelopes, Foster's 3-year-old case, the inside contact, the 9-day window. He told it flat and without editorial because the facts were sufficiently alarming without being dressed. When he finished, The room sat with it the way men sit with something whose full weight is still arriving. Boone spoke first. The inside contact, they know the case was reopened. Yes, Hank said. They know about Foster. Yes. Do they know about us? Boone said. Specifically, by name. Hank thought about it. He thought about Glenn's face passing him at the Desert Safe gate, the calculation in it, the filing of information. They know someone from outside the department has been involved. I don't know what level of detail they have. If Glenn told his contact about the storage unit, Cisco said from the far end of the table, they know it's been found now. Yes, Hank said. So they're moving too, Cisco said. Yes, Hank said. Wheeler, who rarely spoke in church and had the quality of a man whose words accumulated interest before they were spent, said from his corner, the quitclaim deed, the Chino Valley property, whose name was on it? Hank had been waiting for someone to ask. He'd been holding it back, the way you hold back the piece of a thing that changes the shape of the rest of it until the room was ready to hold it. A company, he said. Desert Holdings, LLC, registered in Nevada. He paused. I looked it up this morning. Desert Holdings, LLC has 3 properties in Yavapai County. One of them is the building that houses the satellite office of the County Department of Child Protective Services. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before it. Deeper, colder. Glenn Ashford's company owns the building where the CPS office operates, Boone said slowly. His company, or a company he's associated with, Hank said. The ownership structure is layered. It would take time to untangle, time we don't have. He has a financial relationship with the department, Dex said. His voice was very quiet. Landlord and tenant, that's leverage that doesn't need a manila envelope. That's structural. Which is why the inside contact isn't afraid, Hank said, because the inside contact may not be one person making private choices. It may be a department that is, in ways nobody officially acknowledged, compromised at an institutional level. He looked around the table. We have been trying to use the system to protect Lily. We have been trusting the system to work. What I'm telling you now is that the system we've been trusting has a structural connection to the man we're trying to protect her from. Reyes, who had been silent the entire meeting, said, So what do we do? It was the right question, and Hank had been sitting with the answer for 3 hours, and what he had arrived at was not comfortable, and was not what he had intended when he had chosen the long road, and what it was, precisely, was the long road demanding something from him that he had spent 2 weeks building his willingness to refuse. We go outside the system, he said, but we go outside it correctly. He looked at Dex. I need a forensic accountant who can trace a corporate ownership chain in under a week. He looked at Boone. I need someone who knows investigative journalism in this state, someone with standing, someone who can publish, someone whose publication has the institutional weight to make what we find matter before the hearing. He looked at Wheeler. I need everything you can find on Dale Ashford's movements for the last 6 months, not for confrontation, for documentation. He looked at Reyes. I need you to find a family law attorney who is not in Yavapai County and not connected to anyone who might be connected to Desert Holdings. He looked around the table at all of them. And I need every single one of you to understand that this is not a fight, he said. There will be no confrontation with Glenn or Dale Ashford. There will be no interaction with the inside contact, whoever they are. We are going to build a case that is so solid, so publicly documented, so far outside the reach of what a compromised local system can suppress, that the hearing in 9 days becomes something that cannot be quietly buried. He paused. We are going to make it impossible for them to make Lily disappear again. The room absorbed this. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a truck rumbled past on the road beyond the cinderblock walls. This is going to take all of us, Dex said. Yes, Hank said. And it's going to be visible, Dex said. At that scale. We can't do this quietly. No, Hank said. We can't. What he didn't say, what he held behind the logistics and the assignments and the 9-day deadline, was what he understood about visibility and men like Glenn Ashford. A man who built leverage archives and maintained inside contacts and structured his financial interests to run through the institutions designed to stop him, that man was sophisticated, and sophisticated men had one specific vulnerability. They were invested in the appearance of normalcy, in the surface looking clean. They could absorb a legal threat, a CPS investigation, a sheriff's questioning. What they could not absorb was light, real, wide, public light, the kind that didn't come through official channels, that could be slowed and redirected and filed as inconclusive. Hank was going to bring that light, and Glenn Ashford was going to know it was coming. What Hank didn't know, what he had no way to account for, the variable he had been unable to calculate, was how Glenn would respond when he understood that the quiet game was over. He found out at 11:15 that night. His personal phone rang. Unknown number. He answered because he'd been answering unknown numbers all week and they'd all mattered. Silence on the line. Then breathing. Then a voice he did not recognize, and then did, low, controlled, with the specific flat quality of a man who had made a decision and was past the deliberation of it. Glenn Ashford said, "You should know that your daughter is a very composed young woman." The world stopped. Not metaphorically, not dramatically, physically. Hank's body stopped, every system arrested, the blood taking an extra half-second to complete its circuit, the room doing the thing rooms do in the moment between the thing happening and the understanding of it arriving. "She's at a coffee shop on Cedar Avenue in Flagstaff," Glenn said. "She's been there for about 40 minutes. She's reading something on her phone. She looks like you, a little, around the eyes." A pause. "I thought you'd want to know that someone in Flagstaff is keeping an eye on her, just in case your outside investigation gets too ambitious for the next 9 days." The call ended. Hank was already dialing Casey before the phone left his ear, and the time between the ring and her answer, 3 seconds, 4, the longest seconds he could measure, was a kind of experience he had no adequate category for. The specific terror of a man who has spent years being afraid of nothing discovering, in an instant, the one thing that can reach through every defense he built and make him a person who is afraid. She answered on the 4th ring. "Dad? Where are you right now?" he said. "I'm Cedar Avenue." "Why? What?" "Get up," he said. "Get up right now and go to the counter and ask the person behind it to let you wait in the back." His voice was completely steady, and it cost him everything he had to keep it that way. "Tell them you don't feel safe outside. They'll do it. You go right now, and you stay there, and you don't come out until I call you back. Do you understand me?" A pause. He heard her chair move. He heard her voice, a few words to someone nearby, the register of it changing from confused to following instructions. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'm moving. Dad, what is happening?" "I'll explain everything," he said. "Right now I need you inside and away from the windows and on the phone with me. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. Her voice had the tightly controlled quality of a young woman who was frightened and was not going to let the frightened part run things. He heard his own quality in it, and it went through him like something bright and terrible. "Good," he said. "Good. You're doing exactly right." He was already in the Harley gear, already moving toward the door, already running the math that had just changed in every calculation simultaneously. Because Glenn Ashford had been detained tonight and had made this call anyway, which meant either he'd been released already, or he'd made the call before his detention and set it on a timer, or he had someone else making it on his behalf. And any of those options meant the man had a layer Hank had not found yet, and his daughter was in a coffee shop in Flagstaff, with that layer currently active and watching her. And the 9 days he'd been working with had just become no days. And the careful long road he had been walking had just run out of road. He called Dex, he called Boone, he called Bradley. He stood in the desert iron parking lot in the cold Arizona night and made 3 calls in 90 seconds, and in each one he said the same thing. It moved now, we are out of time. And then he stood for one moment, only one moment, with the phone in his hand and his daughter's voice still in his ear saying, "I'm here. I'm in the back. I'm okay." And he understood, with the absolute clarity that only impossible situations provide, that the man he had been for the last 2 weeks, the careful, patient man who chose the long road and trusted the system and kept his hands where they needed to be, was not the only man available. He had another man inside him, one he had spent years trying to retire, one who knew how to move in the dark, and how to make calculations that didn't require the system's cooperation, and how to protect the people he loved in the specific way that a situation like this, with a man like Glenn, sometimes required. He had spent 2 weeks choosing not to be that man. He stood in the parking lot with the cold coming down from the mountains and the highway, a distant sound, and the neon of the clubhouse sign bleeding red into the dark above him. And he looked at the road that led north toward Flagstaff and his daughter. And he made the only decision left that had any meaning, the decision that would determine not just what happened in the next 9 days, but what kind of man he was going to be when they were over, and whether that man was someone his daughter could look at the way she deserved to be able to look at her father, and whether that man was someone a 7-year-old girl in emergency custody could trust to still be standing when her hearing came. The Harley came alive under him. He rode north into the dark, and behind him, the doors of Desert Iron MC opened, and one by one the engines of his brothers caught and held and joined the night. And the sound of them together on the empty highway was not the sound of men looking for violence. It was the sound of men who had run out of the luxury of patience and were now operating on something older and more essential, the thing that lives underneath patience when patience has been exhausted, the thing that remains when everything careful and measured has been spent. He was going to get his daughter, and then he was going to come back, and he was going to burn Glenn Ashford's careful constructed world to the ground, using nothing but the truth, because the truth, assembled correctly and delivered publicly and made impossible to bury, was the one weapon that a man who had spent years building leverage and maintaining silence and operating in the gaps of the system had never learned to defend against. And Hank Mercer was going to use it with both hands, and he was going to make sure that every person in Yavapai County with the authority to protect a 7-year-old girl understood, before that hearing began, exactly what they were being asked to protect her from. The highway opened up ahead of him. The stars were extraordinary over the desert. His brothers rode behind him, their headlights a constellation in his mirrors. Somewhere ahead, Casey Mercer was sitting in the back of a coffee shop, waiting for her father to come. For the first time in 2 years, he was on his way. Casey was in the back of the coffee shop when he arrived. She was sitting on an overturned milk crate behind the counter with a cup of something she hadn't touched, and her phone in both hands and her face arranged into an expression that was trying very hard to be calm and mostly achieving it, which was more than Hank had managed on the 90-minute ride north. The kid behind the counter, 19 maybe, with the wide eyes of someone whose shift had taken an unexpected turn, stepped back when Hank came through the employee door, reading something in his face that made giving him room feel like the correct instinct. Casey stood up. She looked at him. 2 years of silence and a phone call in the dark, and now this. Her father in a coffee shop back room at midnight, rode cold and carrying everything the last 3 weeks had done to him in the set of his jaw and the way his hands weren't quite still. She said, "You look terrible." He said, "You okay?" "I'm okay." She held his gaze the way she had as a kid, the particular directness of her that he had never managed to teach her and now understood she'd arrived with. "What is happening, Dad?" He told her. He told her fast and without softening because she deserved the actual shape of it, not the protected version. He told her about Lily and Glenn and the storage unit and Desert Holdings and the 9 days and the phone call. He watched her face process it in real time, not falling apart, not shutting down, assembling the information with the specific focused attention of someone who had learned, somewhere in the years he hadn't been present for, how to hold difficult things without dropping them. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. "Someone was actually watching me," she said. "Yes." "Tonight." "Well, yes." She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. "Okay," she said. "What do you need?" He looked at her. He felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean name for. Not pride exactly, or not only pride, but the specific astonishment of a man discovering that the person he failed to protect had become, without his help, someone formidable. "I need you somewhere safe for the next 9 days," he said. "Not here, not Prescott. I have work." "I know." "I have a life, Dad. I can't just—" "Casey." He said her name the way he had on the phone earlier, like a hand on her shoulder. "I am not asking you to disappear. I am asking you to relocate for 9 days with 2 of my people and the ability to work remotely. That's the ask." She looked at him. The 2 years of silence were in the room with them, the shape of all the things that hadn't been said, and the cost of not saying them, and he let it be there because it deserved to be, and because they didn't have time to carry it properly right now, but that wasn't the same as pretending it didn't exist. "The little girl," Casey said. "Lily." "Yes." "She's the reason you called Ruth back." He hadn't known Ruth had told her that. He filed it. "Yes." Casey looked at the floor. She looked up. "Okay," she said. 9 days. Boone was outside with 2 others. Hank put Casey with Boone, gave Boone a contact in Sedona who owed him a quiet favor and had a property that wasn't registered under any name connected to Desert Iron, and watched Boone's truck pull away from Cedar Avenue at 12:40 in the morning with his daughter in the passenger seat. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a moment. The street was empty. The coffee shop's neon sign hummed behind him, a sound like something trying to stay awake. Then he got on the Harley and rode south. He had 8 days. The forensic accountant Dex had found was a woman named Patricia Hale, who operated out of Phoenix and had the specific dry precision of someone who had spent 20 years untangling corporate structures for divorce litigation and fraud cases, and had developed, in the process, a deep and almost aesthetic appreciation for the way money revealed what people were. She worked through the first night on the Desert Holdings chain and called Dex at 4 in the morning with preliminary findings delivered in the same tone someone might use to read a grocery list. Desert Holdings LLC was a Nevada shell connected through 2 intermediate entities to a parent company called Iron Gate Property Group. Iron Gate had 5 directors. One of them was Glenn Ashford. 2 others were names that meant nothing to Hank until Dex ran them through the state contractor database and found that both names appeared on the county's approved vendor list, specifically as consultants on building leases and facility management for 3 county departments, one of which was the Department of Child Protective Services Satellite Office on Commerce Drive. The 4th name was a man named Robert Vance, who had no public profile and no social media presence, and owned, through a separate LLC, 6 residential properties in Yavapai County, 2 of which had been cited for habitability violations in the last 3 years without resolution. The 5th name was Sandra Okafor. Dex brought that name to Hank at 6 in the morning, sitting across from him at the church table with 2 cups of coffee and a printed sheet of Patricia Hale's preliminary findings, and he set the page on the table and put his finger on Sandra Okafor's name and looked at Hank without saying anything else. Hank looked at the name. He thought about where he'd heard it. He reached back through 3 weeks of compressed information and found it. A name on a document he'd seen in Foster's file summary. Not a caseworker, not a director. "Department Legal Counsel," he said. "Department Legal Counsel," Dex confirmed. The inside contact wasn't a caseworker making private choices for private reasons. The inside contact was the attorney responsible for advising the department on case law, procedural compliance, and Hank saw it arrive in full as he looked at the page, on the legal thresholds required to reopen a case classified as inconclusive. Sandra Okafor had advised the department on the legal standard for Lily's case. She had advised on what level of documentation was required to reopen it. She was a director of the company that owned the building the department worked in, and she was in the same LLC structure as Glenn Ashford. She told him the threshold, Hank said, every time. She told him exactly what level of evidence he needed to survive. And probably what procedural vulnerabilities existed in Foster's past cases, Dex said. The 3-year-old case. The procedural violation. Hank stared at the page. Okafor would have access to every CPS attorney correspondence. She would have known about Foster's visit. She would have known before anyone that the co-signature was missing. Dex nodded. She fed it to Glenn's attorney, Hank said. Glenn used it to get the case dismissed, and then kept it in an envelope as insurance in case Foster came back. He sat back. She's not just a contact, she is the architecture. He called Bradley at 6:15. Bradley answered on the first ring, which meant Bradley hadn't slept either. Sandra Okafor, Hank said, County Legal Counsel. She's a director in the same corporate chain as Glenn Ashford. She's the inside. Silence. Then, you have documentation. Patricia Hale has a preliminary chain. It'll hold. We need a state-level investigator, Tom. Someone outside the county. If Okafor is advising the department, she has relationships with everyone inside it that we can't trust right now. Bradley was quiet for a long moment. Hank heard him breathing. I have a contact at the Attorney General's office, he said finally. We went to the academy together. Call him, Hank said. Now, not in the morning, now. It's 6 in the morning. Then you're only waking him up, not dragging him out of a meeting, Hank said. Call him. Bradley called him. The AG's office assigned an investigator by noon. Her name was Chen, and she arrived at Bradley's office at 2:15 with the specific efficient energy of someone who had been briefed in the car and was already 3 steps ahead of the briefing. She sat across from Hale's corporate chain documentation and Margaret Foster's file history and Dex's timeline, and she read all of it with a stillness that Hank recognized as the stillness of a person who was finding the thing they'd suspected was there. Okafor's name has come up before, she said to Bradley, not to Hank. Different context, different county. 18 months ago. She paused. We couldn't establish a chain then. You can establish one now, Hank said. She looked at him. She looked at him the way Foster had looked at him that first time. The specific assessment of a professional woman deciding what category to put him in. He let her look. Mr. Mercer, she said, what you've done here, the documentation, the corporate trace, this is either going to be extremely useful or it's going to be inadmissible, depending on how it was obtained. I need to know exactly what steps were taken. Licensed forensic accountant working from public record filings, he said. Every source is on that page. Nothing was accessed without authorization. He held her gaze. We did it right. She looked at the page again. Something shifted in her face. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. 7 days, she said. That's what I need. You have 7, Hank said. The hearing is in 8. 7 days was the kind of time that either stretched or compresses based on the weight of what you're carrying, and Hank experienced those 7 days as both simultaneously. Each hour granular and specific, each night longer than it had any right to be, and the whole span somehow arriving at its end before he had adequately prepared for what it contained. He saw Lily twice. The first time was arranged through Foster, who had maintained her role on the case with the specific tenacity of a woman who understood that stepping back now would mean leaving the field to the people who had spent 3 years trying to exhaust her. She brought Lily to a neutral meeting space on the 4th day, a family services office on Goodwin Street with a window that looked onto a small courtyard and furniture that had been specifically chosen to look as unlike an institution as furniture in an institution could manage. Lily came in with the Foster family's caseworker and stopped just inside the door. She looked at the room. She looked at Foster. She looked at Hank. She was wearing a yellow shirt. He noticed that specifically because yellow was a color that required a certain kind of confidence to wear, and she was wearing it the way a person wears something they have recently decided they're allowed to have. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. She came and sat in the chair across from him. Not beside him, across, which was the considered distance of a child who was still measuring. He respected the distance. He sat in it with her, without trying to collapse it. Are you coming to my hearing? She said. Yes, he said. She looked at him. Are other people coming? Some people, he said. People who think you matter. She considered this. Her hands were in her lap. He noticed, with the specific attention he had trained on her from 100 feet away in parking lots and farmers' markets, that her hands were still, not the rigid stillness of control, just still, the way hands are when they are not afraid of what might happen to them. Ruth says you've been working really hard, she said. Ruth talks too much, he said. Lily almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile he had seen on her face in 3 weeks of watching, and it arrived and departed quickly, a flash of something that lived in her under all the careful training, something that had not been extinguished. Are you going to keep being around? She said. After. He looked at her. He looked at this 7-year-old person who had, in the specific way of children who have been failed by adults, learned to ask the question before the investment rather than after. Yes, he said. That's my plan. She nodded. She looked at the window. Okay, she said, as if they had agreed on something specific. They had. The second time he saw her was the day before the hearing, a brief visit authorized by the Foster family, 20 minutes at a park on the north side of town. She showed him a rock she had found that she said looked like a dog if you looked at it right. He looked at it from every angle she suggested. He told her he could see the dog. She told him he was lying. It only looked like a dog from the left side. And she seemed pleased rather than troubled by this distinction. And he thought about what it meant that a child who had been systematically told that her perceptions were wrong was now calibrating the difference between what you could see and what you were told to see. He thought it meant she was going to be all right, eventually, with work, with time, with people who showed up. He rode home with the rock in his jacket pocket because she had given it to him and told him to keep it for the hearing, for luck. He was not a superstitious man. He kept the rock. Chen moved fast and she moved correctly. By day 5, she had documented the corporate chain to a legal standard she described as solid, and by day 6, she had a statement from a former CPS caseworker in Maricopa County, the woman who had taken early retirement 14 months ago, who had carried the knowledge of what Okafor had done for over a year and had not come forward because she had not believed coming forward was survivable. Chen gave her a structure in which it was survivable, and the woman gave her a statement, and by the evening of day 7, Okafor had been placed on administrative leave pending the AG investigation, her access to department files suspended, her name removed from the list of counsel advising on Lily's case. Glenn Ashford's attorney moved to delay the hearing the following morning. The motion was reviewed by a family court judge who had been specifically briefed by Chen's office on the nature of the investigation and who denied the motion in 45 minutes, which was fast enough to carry its own statement about what the judge thought of the motion. The hearing was on. Hank was awake at 3 in the morning on the day of the hearing. He sat in the desert iron garage with a cup of coffee and the stone in his pocket and the specific quiet of a man who has done everything he could do and is now in the territory where doing becomes waiting and waiting becomes its own form of work. Dex came in at 4. He didn't ask why Hank was there. He made his own coffee. He sat on the workbench. Boone called, Dex said. Casey wants to come. Hank looked at his hands. She's supposed to stay in Sedona until... Okafor's suspended, Dex said. The leverage is documented. Glenn's attorney is running out of road. He paused. She wants to be there. Hank, your daughter wants to be at the hearing. He sat with that. He turned the rock over in his fingers. Tell Boone to bring her, he said. At 7 in the morning, his phone started ringing with calls he hadn't expected. Riders. Not just Desert Iron, other clubs, independents, veterans he hadn't spoken to in years. Word had moved through channels he hadn't activated, the way word moves in communities that are smaller than the world thinks and more connected than the world expects. They had heard about Lily, about the hearing, about a little girl who had been invisible to the system until a man on a Harley decided she wasn't. They wanted to come. He said yes. He said come, and he said come clean. No colors that would read as threat, professional and visible and human. He said come as witnesses, not warriors. He said come because a child who has been made to feel like she doesn't matter deserves to see, once, at the scale of hundreds, that she does. By 8:30, the streets around the Yavapai County Courthouse were beginning to fill with the sound he had lived with for 19 years. The particular layered thunder of Harley's gathering, an orchestral accumulation of displacement and chrome, and men who had each, in their own way, arrived at a morning that required them. He counted past 200 before he stopped counting. Bradley was at the courthouse entrance. He looked at the street and then at Hank with an expression that carried about 7 different things in it simultaneously. You could have warned me, he said. Would you have tried to stop it? Hank said. Bradley looked at the street again. No, he said. But I would have brought more deputies. Chen was inside, already in position. Foster was there, composed and steady, and wearing the face of a woman who had spent 3 years watching the system fail and was present at the moment it was going to try again with better information. Ruth Pennington was sitting in the gallery in her good coat, her hands in her lap, and when she saw Hank, she gave him a look that he received as the specific acknowledgement of 2 people who had each held something heavy for a long time and were now, finally, setting it down together. Casey arrived at 8:55. Boone brought her to the courthouse steps, and she came up them with the deliberate pace of someone who had been thinking about what to say and had not yet decided. And she stopped in front of him and looked at him in the morning light with her mother's cheekbones and his eyes, and 2 years of complicated history in the set of her jaw. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We'll see how the day goes." He almost smiled. He thought she did too, briefly. They went inside. The courtroom was smaller than the street. Courtrooms always were. The formality of it, the wood paneling, the elevated bench, the careful professional language that the law used to discuss the lives of children, was its own kind of pressure, a different register from the one outside where hundreds of engines were ticking down to silence in the October morning. Lily was brought in at 9:15. She came with her foster family's caseworker, and she was wearing the yellow shirt again, and she looked at the room the way she looked at everything, measuring, careful, reading the adults for information about what was safe. She found Hank. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the window. Glenn Ashford's attorney opened with a motion that had been stripped of its primary arguments by Chen's investigation and was now a narrower, more technical objection about procedural timelines in the original case filing. The family court judge, a woman named Hartwell, who had the quality of a person who has seen every version of this and developed, from that exposure, a specific and implacable clarity, listened to the motion with her hands folded and her face giving nothing away, and then denied it in 2 sentences. Glenn's attorney tried twice more. Both denials came faster than the first. Foster testified. She was precise and documented, and she delivered the chain of evidence. Medical records, Ruth's account, the pattern of prior case interference, the corporate connection to Okafor, with the methodical care of a woman who understood that she was in a room where every word was material and she had prepared every word accordingly. Ruth Pennington testified. She was 71 years old and she sat in the witness chair with her hands folded, and she told the truth about what she had seen and heard over 14 months with the simple, undecorated authority of a person who has been waiting to tell it in a place where it would be received. And when Glenn's attorney tried to challenge her credibility using the harassment complaint, Judge Hartwell looked at the complaint and then at the attorney and said, "This complaint was filed the same morning the case was reopened. I'll note that for the record," and moved on. Chen provided a summary of the AG investigation's preliminary findings. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. Hank was not called to testify. He sat in the gallery beside Casey, and he held the rock from the park, and he watched Lily, who was seated at a table with a court-appointed advocate, and who sat through the proceedings with a stillness that was different from the stillness he had watched for 3 weeks in parking lots and diners. It wasn't the stillness of someone making herself invisible. It was the stillness of someone waiting. Actually, waiting with some form of trust, however fragile, that the wait had a destination. Glenn's attorney made his final argument. It was diminished and clearly knew it was diminished. The argument of a case that had expected to operate in a gap between what was documented and what was provable, and had found, instead, that the gap had been closed. Judge Hartwell called a 15-minute recess. She returned in 12. She spoke for 4 minutes. She covered the documentation and the investigation and the history of the case and the pattern of interference and the standard of evidence before her, and she reached her conclusion in language that was formal and measured and landed in the courtroom like something that had been a long time arriving. Permanent protective custody. Foster family retained. Supervised visitation request by Glenn Ashford denied pending the conclusion of the criminal investigation. A guardian ad litem appointed for the duration of the adoption process, should one proceed. She said Lily's name 3 times in the ruling, which Hank noticed, and he thought that Judge Hartwell had noticed the same thing he had about what it meant for a child to be named, to be made specific, to be treated as a person with a particular identity rather than a case file with a number. The courtroom did what courtrooms do after a ruling. The professional dispersal, the paperwork, the mechanical continuation of official process. Foster caught Hank's eye across the room. She gave him a nod that carried the weight of 3 weeks and everything they had both held in those weeks, and then she looked away. Because they were both professionals, and this was a professional moment. Lily's caseworker brought her toward the door. Lily walked past the gallery. She stopped beside Hank. She looked at him. He looked back. He didn't say anything. He had learned in 3 weeks that the things that needed to be said between them didn't always need words. She reached into the pocket of her yellow shirt. She produced, carefully, a folded piece of paper. She held it out. He took it. He looked at her. "I made it last night," she said. "In case." He unfolded it. It was a drawing in crayon. The simple graphic language of a 7-year-old, but with the specific detail of a child who looked carefully at the world she drew. A motorcycle, a small figure, a larger figure beside it, and above them both, in the determined printing of a child who had recently decided that her letters were allowed to be big, 2 words: "Thank you." He folded it back. He put it in his jacket pocket beside the rock. He looked at Lily. "You ready to go outside?" he said. She looked at the door. She looked at him. "Are there a lot of people?" she said. "Some," he said. She seemed to think about this. She squared her small shoulders in the yellow shirt with the unconscious solemnity of someone preparing for something significant. "Okay," she said. They walked to the courthouse doors together, not holding hands, not quite, but close enough that the distance between them was a choice rather than a gap. And Hank pushed the door open, and the sound came in like a physical thing, the accumulated rumble of 400 engines ticking and idling, and the low human sound of hundreds of men standing in the October morning, and the specific acoustic quality of a large crowd that is being quiet on purpose, which is louder in its way than noise. Lily stopped in the doorway. She looked at the street. She looked at the riders, the leather and the chrome and the weathered faces, and the hands that had built things and broken things and held on to things in the specific way that only people who have lost things know how to hold. And she was very still for a moment, the 7-year-old person in a yellow shirt, looking at the world that had gathered because she existed. And then she raised both arms, not reaching for something, not trying to get to something out of her reach, just raising them, straight up, freely, into the cold October air, with the specific and uncomplicated wholeness of a body that has just remembered it is allowed to take up space. The sound that came from 400 people was not a cheer. It was something lower and more genuine than a cheer. The sound of people responding to a thing they hadn't expected to feel as much as they felt it. Hank stood beside her. He looked at the street and the riders and the morning. He felt Casey's hand find his arm briefly and then release it, and he felt the rock in his pocket and the folded drawing beside it, and he stood in the doorway of the Yavapai County Courthouse on a morning in October and watched a little girl hold her arms up in the light. He had ridden into this 3 weeks ago, following an instinct he couldn't name through a parking lot on a Tuesday morning. He had ridden carefully and then urgently and then desperately and then with everything he had, and the road had cost him more than he'd budgeted and delivered more than he'd believed possible. And he was standing at what felt like the end of it but wasn't. He understood that, standing here, that this was not the end of anything but a beginning, wearing the face of a conclusion. Lily looked up at him. She was still holding her arms up. "Can we go see the motorcycles?" she said. He looked at her. He looked at the street. He looked at the 400 men who had ridden in from across Arizona because a man they knew, or knew of, had decided a forgotten child was worth riding for. "Yeah," he said, "we can go see the motorcycles." They walked down the courthouse steps together into the sound and the morning, and behind them Casey Mercer descended the steps alone, watching her father walk beside a little girl with her arms in the air, and she pressed her hand to her mouth briefly, just once, before she squared her own shoulders and followed them down into the light, and the engines of Desert Iron MC rose around them like something ancient and warm and sure, and Prescott, Arizona rang with the sound of it from one end of Gurley Street to the other, and it did not stop for a long time. The engines faded one by one through the afternoon. It happened the way large things dissolve, not all at once, but in increments, each departure its own small ending, until the street outside the courthouse was just a street again, ordinary and wind-scoured under the October sky, carrying only the faint smell of exhaust and something warmer underneath it that might have been the specific residue of 400 people choosing for one morning to mean something together. Hank stood on the sidewalk and watched them go. He didn't count them out the way he'd stopped counting them in. He just watched, with the particular quality of attention a man gives to things he wants to remember accurately. Not romantically, not larger than they were, but true. The cold had come down harder through the afternoon. His hands were stiff in his jacket pockets. The rock was in the left one. The drawing was in the right. He checked both of them twice without realizing he was doing it. Ruth found him there. She came down the courthouse steps in her good coat with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee she'd produced from somewhere inside, and she stood beside him and looked at the emptying street and didn't say anything for a while, which was one of the things he had come to value about her. She asked about Thanksgiving, Ruth said eventually. Hank looked at her. Lily, she asked the caseworker whether there would be a place to go for Thanksgiving. Ruth looked at her coffee. The caseworker said yes, absolutely. The Foster family has plans. And Lily said okay, and then she asked whether you'd be there. Hank looked back at the street. The caseworker told her that wasn't something she could promise, Ruth said. And Lily said, he'll come if he says he will. Santa, Ruth paused. She said it the way you state a fact. Not a hope, a fact. The cold moved through the gap in his jacket. He let it. I'll be there, he said. Ruth nodded once, as if this was precisely what she'd expected him to say, and she'd come to deliver the question specifically to hear him say it. She put her hand briefly on his arm, the dry, specific warmth of a 71-year-old woman who had been watching a child through a fence for 14 months and had held on until someone came. And then she walked back up the steps and inside. Glenn Ashford was formally charged 6 days after the hearing. The AG's investigation moved with the accelerated purpose of an office that had found something it had been looking for elsewhere and recognized the shape of it immediately. Sandra Okafor was charged separately. 3 counts of obstruction, 2 of fraud, 1 count that Hank's attorney described as the one that would actually matter when it reached a jury. Dale Ashford received a restraining order and a strongly worded conversation from Sheriff Bradley that Bradley described to Hank as the most enjoyable professional interaction he'd had in a calendar year. Robert Vance, the 4th name on the Desert Holdings Board, turned out to be a retired building inspector whose cooperation with the AG's office came with the speed of a man who had understood, the moment he was contacted, that the most expensive thing in the room was the thing he'd been protecting. He provided documents that resolved 3 questions Chen had been carrying for 18 months from a prior investigation in a different county. Hank didn't hear the details of that. He didn't need them. That was Chen's work. And Chen was good at her work. And he had learned in the last 3 weeks that one of the most important skills a man could develop was knowing the precise edge of his own jurisdiction. He went to see Foster on the Thursday after the hearing. Not at her office. She'd suggested May's diner, which Hank recognized as a deliberate choice, a return to ordinary civilian space, the specific message of 2 people agreeing that the operational phase was over. She was already there when he arrived, in the corner booth with coffee and a look on her face that had shed the professional armor it had been carrying for 3 weeks, and revealed underneath it something that was just tired and honest and human. He sat across from her. May's waitress brought him coffee without being asked, which was what happened when you'd been coming to a place for 19 years. Okafor told her contact about your first call to the department, Foster said. Not as an accusation. As a thing she needed to say out loud so it could stop living only inside her. The morning you filed, within 2 hours. I know, he said. I should have seen it sooner. She looked at her cup. The pattern was there. I chose to explain it other ways. You were working inside a compromised system without being able to name the compromise, he said. That's not a failure of observation. That's a structural problem. She looked at him. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, he said. There's a difference. She considered that. She drank her coffee. Outside, a truck rolled past on Montezuma Street, and the diner's windows registered the vibration in the way of old glass that had been registering vibrations for a long time. She's going to be okay, Foster said. Lily, I've seen enough of these to know which ones, and she's going to be okay. It'll take time. It'll take the right people staying. She looked at him directly. Are you going to stay? He put his hand in his jacket pocket. He felt the rock. He thought about a yellow shirt and arms raised in October light. Yeah, he said. I'm going to stay. The Desert Iron Clubhouse on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the hearing, was a different place than it had been a month ago, though nothing visible had changed. Same cinder block walls, same refrigerator that hummed in the church room, same smell of engine grease and old coffee, and the particular accumulated human residue of men who had been using the same space to be honest with each other for over a decade. What had changed was something in the atmosphere, a quality Hank noticed but couldn't precisely name until Dex named it for him, passing him in the garage with a torque wrench and saying, without breaking stride, "We feel like something now." Hank thought about that. He thought about what something meant when applied to 17 men who had each come to this place by the specific route of running out of everywhere else, and finding, unexpectedly, that the place they ran out of options was the place they were supposed to be. "We always were something," Hank said. Dex looked back at him from the doorway. "Yeah," he said, "but now we know what." Casey stayed for a week after the hearing. She stayed in a motel on Sheldon Street, and she came to the clubhouse twice, which was 2 more times than Hank had expected, and both times she sat in the garage with coffee and watched the work, and didn't say much, and he didn't push her to say much. The second time she came, she helped Boone bleed a brake line on a member's bike, because she had apparently learned to do this somewhere in the 2 years of her life that Hank hadn't been present for, which was one of several dozen things he was slowly discovering about who his daughter had become without him. On the morning she left for Flagstaff, she stood beside her car in the Desert Iron parking lot in the early cold with her bag in the back and her keys in her hand, and she looked at her father with the direct, complicated look she'd been giving him since she was 4 years old. "I'm not ready for everything to be okay," she said. "Between us. I need you to know that." "I know," he said, "but I'm not done." She looked at the keys in her hand. "That's different from being ready. Not done is different." "I know that too," he said. She looked up. The morning was gray and cold, and the mountains were hidden in cloud, and the parking lot smelled of gravel and recent rain and the particular clean emptiness of early hours. "The little girl," Casey said. "Lily. Yeah. She's lucky." A pause. "That you were in that parking lot." He thought about the hardware store, the water bottle on the tailgate, the small arms that stopped. "I was standing in the right place," he said. Casey looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded. A single, considered nod that contained more than nods usually contain. And she got in her car, and he stood in the parking lot and watched her pull onto the road, and he held the moment with the specific care of a man who has learned, at some cost, the difference between holding on and letting go, and that both things could coexist in the same gesture. Thanksgiving was at Ruth Pennington's house. This was not what anyone had planned, because no one had specifically planned it, which was how the best things tended to arrive. Through the accumulated momentum of small choices that each made sense in isolation and turned out, together, to have been building toward something. Ruth had a table that seated 8 comfortably and 12 if everyone was willing to commit to the experience, and there were 14 people in her house on Thanksgiving afternoon, which meant the overflow ate on TV trays in the living room, and nobody seemed to mind. Dex was there. Boone was there with his daughter, who was 17 and looked at the Desert Iron members with the tolerant skepticism of a teenager who had grown up around large men with motorcycles and had filed them under harmless. Wheeler brought food he'd cooked at home because he'd heard Ruth say she was making green bean casserole, and he had opinions about green bean casserole that he was willing to act on. Lily was there with her foster family, Sandra and Pete Morales, who were warm people in the specific, unpretentious way of people who fostered children because they had assessed what they had to offer and decided it was worth offering. Sandra Morales had the quality of a woman who made room without making a production of making room, which Hank appreciated in the specific way of a man who had spent years in rooms where people made productions. Lily sat between Hank and Ruth at the main table. She ate with the focused enthusiasm of a child who had recently discovered that food came without conditions attached, and she asked questions about everything on the table with a directness that made Boone's daughter lose her skeptical expression entirely and start actually answering. At some point in the afternoon between the food and whatever came after, Lily leaned close to Hank and said, in the particular register of a private communication in a crowded room, "Pete says maybe I can stay with them forever." Hank looked at her. "Like, really stay," she said. "Not just for a while." "What do you think about that?" he said. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She looked at her plate. She looked at Ruth. She looked at the room full of people eating and talking and existing around her with the comfortable noise of people who had chosen to be in the same place. "I think I want to," she said, "but I want to make sure you still come around, even if I'm staying somewhere official." "Lily," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She studied his face for a moment. The specific measuring look she had, the one that had been assessing adults since long before she should have needed to, reading them for the cost of trust. He let her read. He had learned to sit in that look without moving because she deserved to read him accurately and not have him manage what she found. Whatever she found, she nodded. She went back to her food. Across the table, Ruth caught his eye. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The adoption was finalized on a Tuesday in February, 4 months after the hearing, at the same Yavapai County Courthouse where October had changed the shape of things. The day was cold and clear, the kind of clear that the Arizona winter produces on its good days when the sky is the specific blue of something that has decided to be entirely itself without qualification. Hank was there. Dex was there. Ruth was there in her good coat. Casey had driven down from Flagstaff, which was not a small thing, and she sat in the gallery beside Boone and looked at the proceedings with the careful attention of a woman who was present on purpose. The room was smaller than it had been in October. No gallery packed with bikers. No AG investigator with a briefcase full of corporate chain documentation. Just a family court hearing, formal and quiet, with a judge and 2 people who had decided to be parents, and a 7-year-old in a yellow shirt. A different yellow shirt from October's one, but yellow, definitively yellow, a color she appeared to have claimed as a position, who sat in the courtroom and watched the adults complete the paperwork that made official what she had apparently already decided was true. When it was done, when Judge Hartwell signed the last page and said the words that the law used for this particular human event, Lily turned around in her chair and looked at the gallery. She looked at Ruth and at Casey and at Dex and at Boone's daughter, who had come specifically for this and would not have admitted it was specifically for this. She looked at all of them. Then she looked at Hank. He was sitting in the second row with his hands on his knees and his jacket on and the rock still in his pocket. He had kept it there every day since October without consciously deciding to, because some things you carry until you understand what carrying them meant. And he looked back at her with the steady, level gaze he had given her the first time outside the library, the one that said, "I am here, and I am not going to need anything from you in return." She climbed off her chair. She walked across the courtroom to him, which was not strictly what the proceedings called for at this moment, but Judge Hartwell made no move to redirect her, because Judge Hartwell had been doing this long enough to know when something was more important than procedure. Lily stopped in front of him. She held out her hand, palm up. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He reached into his jacket pocket and he put the rock in her hand. The rock from the park. The one she'd said looked like a dog from the left side. The one she'd given him for luck, and that he had carried for 4 months through everything that had happened since. She closed her fingers around it. She looked at it in her fist. Then she raised both arms, not as high as she had on the courthouse steps in October, not the full sky reach of that moment, but up, genuinely up, in the small, ordinary space of a courtroom on a Tuesday in February. And she put them around his neck, and he put his around her, and she was small, and she smelled like the particular combination of whatever soap the Morales family used, and the cold morning outside, and something warm underneath all of it that he didn't have a name for and didn't need one. He held on. Outside, when they came down the courthouse steps into the February morning, the street was quieter than October. No 400 engines, no orchestral accumulation of chrome and purpose. Just the ordinary Prescott Street on a Tuesday, going about its business, indifferent and real. But Dex was there, and Boone, and 3 other Desert Iron members who had come without being asked, and they were parked across the street with their bikes and their cuts and their particular quality of men who had learned to show up, not for the dramatic moments only, but for the ordinary ones, the Tuesday and February ones, the ones that didn't look like anything from the outside, but were, in the specific accounting of a life, everything. Lily looked at them across the street. She raised her hand. Wheeler, who rarely smiled in public and had opinions about green bean casserole, raised his back. Hank stood on the courthouse steps with his hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder. Not the grip of ownership, not the weight of obligation, just the specific warmth of one person acknowledging the presence of another. And he looked at the street, and the bikes, and the February sky, and the particular ordinary Tuesday of it all. He thought about the hardware store parking lot, the water bottle on the tailgate, the small arms that had stopped reaching and what it had cost a child to learn to stop. He thought about Ruth on her porch, watching through a fence for 14 months. He thought about Casey driving down from Flagstaff on a Tuesday because some things were worth the drive. He thought about the long road and what it had cost and what it had returned and whether those two columns balanced. And he decided that balance wasn't the right way to think about it, that some things didn't balance. They just were, and you carried them, and they changed you, and the change was the point. Lily looked up at him. "Can we get hot chocolate?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "We can get hot chocolate." They walked off the courthouse steps and into the February morning, and behind them the courthouse stood in the cold blue air of a day that had decided to be clear, and the bikes across the street came to life one by one, not in the thunder of October, but in the lower, quieter register of engines that were going somewhere ordinary and near, somewhere that involved hot chocolate and a Tuesday, and the continued unremarkable fact of being present, which was the only promise that had ever mattered, and the only one that Hank Mercer, at 47 years old, and finally beginning to understand the shape of the life he was building, intended to keep.